Welcome to the history section. Our investigation today is centered on a really fascinating period of conflict and cultural exchange. We're looking at the arrival and the dominance of the Northmen in Ireland.
And specifically, we're trying to synthesize these two often conflicting sets of accounts, the native Irish annals on one hand and the Scandinavian sagas on the other.
Right. It's not just about what happened, but also how those events were well remembered, and later how they were used, even mythologized in Irish political life.
To really get a grip on that, we have to start with Ireland's position at the time, both historically and geographically. It was,
It was the main Celtic stronghold.
exactly. It stands as the chief land of the ancient Celtic tribes, and it held on to that identity long after related peoples were displaced. You see the Britons pushed into Wales, the Caledonians confined to northern Scotland, and the Hebrides.
But the Irish maintained control over their entire country.
They did, and that persistence is absolutely key. Even after the later conquests, first by the Norwegians, and then, of course, the English, the native Irish population still occupied the vast majority of the island.
So they always outnumbered the settlers?
Far superior numbers, yes. Foreign control was often, established along the coasts and in certain key towns, but the fundamental character of the population, the interior, that remained overwhelmingly native.
And that allowed the culture to survive.
Precisely. Throughout the Middle Ages, you see the ancient Irish language, the customs, all of it was preserved. It allowed for this incredible continuity of a national identity.
Which in turn made the struggle against attempts to subdue them so long and so severe.
It did. And history tells us that this struggle was compounded by other factors, crippling factors, really. You had the internal tribal divisions, oppression from outside, and then devastating periods of pestilence and famine.
Let's turn to the island itself for a moment. The physical factors that both, I suppose, protected it and also invited invasion.
Well, despite having large areas of boggy land and less farmable districts, Ireland is, overall, exceptionally well suited for agriculture.
And that's tied to the Atlantic.
Inextricably. The oceanic influence is vital. You have these mild breezes coming across the Atlantic that prevent frost or snow from lasting for any real length of time.
Which creates that famous landscape.
It creates a rare and exceptionally luxuriant vegetation. The richness of the fields and pastures, it's just incomparable in Northern Europe. That's the real origin of the name, the Emerald Isle. It's a direct description of its green meadows.
And beyond the agriculture, the economic potential for a rising maritime power must have been immense.
Oh, absolutely. The island is cut through with numerous rivers, many of them navigable and full of fish, and the seas surrounding it have rich fisheries. It's a constant, vital food source.
And its position, jutting out into the Atlantic, that offered crucial facilities for navigation, especially looking west towards America in later centuries.
If those resources had been properly managed by a unified nation, they could have been an inexhaustible source of wealth. And this wasn't a secret.
The Scandinavians knew about it.
They did. The research shows that Ireland's reputation for its charm, its mild climate and beauty, was well established in the Scandinavian North long before the major conquests. We have documents.
Like the Congaspile.
Exactly. The Mirror of Kings, compiled around 1200 AD.
And that's not just a travel guide, is it? It's more of a manual for a young prince covering ethics and strategy. For it to mention Ireland is significant.
It speaks volumes about the island's reputation. The Congaspile states that Ireland is, and I'm quoting here, almost the best of the lands we are acquainted with, although no vines grow there.
That qualification about the vines is telling.
It underscores just how highly they valued the climate and fertility. This is coming from people used to the harsh conditions of mainland Scandinavia. It really confirms the strategic necessity of focusing on Ireland.
Especially when you think about where else they were settling. Greenland, the North Atlantic islands, those are bleak places.
Compared to those, the Emerald Isle was an opportunity that was just too great to ignore, and became even more critical given Ireland's proximity to their colonies already growing in England and Scotland. It was a strategic keystone for their whole western expansion.
But despite that appeal, actually conquering the island was another matter entirely.
Extremely difficult, yes. The geography itself offered substantial natural defenses. Its remote location, so far west in the Atlantic, acted as a natural barrier against large, coordinated invasion forces from the continent.
And the terrain itself, once you got there.
The terrain was a huge advantage for the defenders. With the exception of some plains on the eastern coast, the country is rugged and mountainous.
Which provides places to hide.
Secure and numerous retreats for the native population. An invading force tries to move inland, and the Irish could simply withdraw into the hills. It makes total subjugation of the interior an almost impossible task.
And you can't discount the people themselves. Ireland was and is the second largest of the British Isles. It had a large population even in ancient times.
Comparable to the 6 or 7 million recorded much later. And what's more, the Irish had embraced Christianity and a certain level of civilization very early on, which suggests, a potential for a high degree of organization.
So here's the paradox. You have these scattered Norwegian forces arriving by sea with very limited support from their settlements in Britain.
And they're pitted against a numerous and by no means unwarlike people who are defending an extensive and mountainous country. Getting timely, massive help from back home in Scandinavia was, for the most part, a physical impossibility.
Which brings us to this great contradiction. The Roman Empire, which held Britain for centuries, never got a firm footing in Ireland.
Never. And the Anglo-Saxons, who completely subjugated England, also failed to make any significant inroads.
And yet, the research is clear that considerable Scandinavian settlements were formed as early as the 9th century.
Right. How does that happen? If these huge centralized powers like Rome and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms failed, how did these decentralized bands of Vikings, relying on ships and limited local support, manage to establish a dominion that lasted over 3 centuries in all the most important coastal areas?
It seems completely counterintuitive.
The answer, according to both the Irish and the Scandinavian chronicles, isn't about the strength of the invaders. It's about the fatal weakness of the defenders.
They couldn't unite.
They remained too fragmented, too at variance with one another. The Norwegians exercised that great influence for 3 centuries, precisely because the Irish failed to coalesce into a cohesive unit that could repel even a, relatively speaking, small group of Scandinavians.
So the core cause of Ireland's misfortune wasn't external power, but this chronic internal division.
That's the thesis that emerges.
Yeah.
This disunity allowed a handful of Scandinavians, a handful relative to the total population, to gain effective mastery over the most strategic parts of the island.
The coastal ports.
Primarily, the places that offered economic and naval superiority. Their success wasn't so much a military conquest of the whole island, but more a strategic infiltration and control of key bottlenecks.
And this failure to resist the Northmen, it really paved the way for what came later with the English.
It did. The fragmented political landscape meant that one Irish king or chieftain could often be played against another. The Scandinavians were masters of forming tactical, temporary alliances with various Irish factions, which prolonged the conflict and ultimately ensured their own survival.
And the legacy of this long presence, it's still incredibly striking in Ireland today.
Oh, absolutely. You travel through the country, and you're immediately reminded of this ancient dominion. It's remarkable how prominent a role the Norwegians, though they're almost universally called Danes in popular culture, play in legends and traditions, even far inland.
That confusion itself between Norwegians and Danes, that tells you something about how trauma gets generalized over time.
It is. And the legacy is often preserved in physical memorials. The most common are the Danish raths.
The mounds and entrenchments.
Yeah, exactly. They dot the landscape. Locals will point them out as sites connected to the invaders. A really famous example is the Danes Cast in Ulster, a long ditch and rampart that shows the scale of these works.
And you also find artifacts from their daily lives.
People often point to Danish cooking places. These are small, circular spaces set round with stones with clear traces of burning. You find them scattered across heaths and moors.
So, temporary encampments.
Likely. Or field kitchens used during foraging or military campaigns. It indicates a widespread, if temporary, presence in the rural areas, even if the permanent settlements were mostly coastal.
And what about the Danes' hammers?
In the south, near old copper mines, they sometimes unearth these roundish stones with a distinct dent around the middle. They were clearly used as hammers for working the mines, and the common people immediately call them Danes' hammers.
So Danish just became a catch-all term for any ancient artifact.
Pretty much. Weapons, coins, ornaments, if it's old and found in the ground, it's generally labeled Danish in popular usage, regardless of its actual origin.
What's so profound about this is the emotional connection to these places. The further west you go, the more terrifying the stories become.
Yes, narratives recounting cruel oppression and the distress people suffered. But what's fascinating is that the memory is contradictory. Irish popular culture also preserved the memory of the Danes' irresistible bravery and their contempt for death.
So they're reviled for their cruelty, but admired for their prowess.
Exactly. You still hear phrases in some parts of the country like, that might even frighten a Dane, when describing something particularly dangerous. It suggests a deep, lingering respect for their military tenacity, even amid all the historical hatred.
And this fear even became part of folklore.
The documented fact. This sort of generalized, superstitious fear of these historical invaders seized the common people. In several parts of the country, the Danes are still used to frighten children. It just underscores how profoundly this memory of oppression permeated the society.
And these kinds of misconceptions, they weren't limited to folklore. They persisted among the educated classes as well.
For instance, until relatively recently, many educated men in Ireland held the firm belief that certain families in Denmark still held titles derived from large estates their ancestors had conquered in Ireland.
Which speaks to an exaggerated view of how permanent their landholding was.
It does. And perhaps even more widespread was the idea about cultural artifacts. This popular notion that the Danes had carried off vast numbers of manuscripts and scientific treasures from Ireland.
And that they were all sitting in a collection in Copenhagen.
Right. It became a convenient explanation for any gaps in the historical record. But it just ignores the basic logistics of the Viking Age. It's highly improbable that the chief aim of these dangerous sea voyages was to carry off manuscripts in a language they couldn't read.
Their priority would have been portable wealth. Gold, silver.
Exactly. Not heavy scholarly texts.
The most famous architectural error, of course, involves the round towers.
Ah, yes. The Danish towers. These incredible slender stone structures were, for a long time in the 18th and 19th centuries, proclaimed to be Danish constructions.
Which completely ignores the evidence.
Completely. They are clearly of Christian origin. They served as belfries and, crucially, as places of security for the clergy and their treasures. They were built against the Vikings, not by them. Their entire purpose was defensive.
And it's a similar story with places like New Grange.
The large stone sepulchral chambers. They were also frequently classified as Danish, even though they date from the prehistorical Stone Age. They predate the Northmen by millennia.
And we know that's wrong because the records say the Vikings plundered them.
Precisely. Both the sagas and the Irish chronicles mention the Norsemen plundering these ancient sepulchres, looking for any treasure buried inside. A conqueror doesn't typically build a magnificent structure just to immediately plunder it for old artifacts.
So we see this real shift in academic opinion over time, from a somewhat favorable view of the Norwegians to this now opposing extreme.
Yes, the commonly received opinion in modern political history is that the Scandinavian conquerors did nothing but plunder and burn, that they annihilated a considerable civilization that had flourished for centuries.
And in that narrative, the Danes become the villains who subverted Irish independence and set the stage for the English conquest. It's a powerful narrative. But while it captures the trauma of the period, it still sidesteps that central issue we identified, the internal failure. It remains impossible to ignore that the Irish population was so divided that they failed to resist a mere handful of Scandinavians. That self-inflicted vulnerability is a crucial and active cause of the island's subsequent misfortunes. And that polarized view of the Norse period, it wasn't an accident. It was shaped very deliberately by political strategy.
Significantly, we have to turn to the 19th century, to a crucial period where the history of these Danish conquests was seized upon and used as a constant and very effective means of agitation against England.
This is when Daniel O'Connell emerges. His goal is the repeal of the Act of Union, to restore the Parliament in Dublin. To do that, he needs to mobilize the people.
And to do that, he needed to awaken this visceral feeling of freedom and ancient glory. That meant reaching back into Irish history for a period of undisputed independence.
But that presented a problem with the timeline.
It did. Genuine, unchallenged Irish independence was more than 1,000 years prior. That history was too remote, too abstract for the largely uneducated population he was trying to influence.
So he needed something more recent, more memorable.
He was a master strategist. He shrewdly chose historical events that were closer in time and whose memories still lived vividly among the people, reinforced by all those physical monuments and terrifying tales we just discussed.
And he framed the Danes as the prequel to the English, the Saxons.
Exactly. He flattered Irish self-love by depicting a history where the Irish had achieved this great triumph in the past by completely driving out the Danes. The implication was clear.
If we could do it then, we can do it now.
Precisely. If your ancestors could organize to expel the Danish conquerors, then there's certainly nothing to prevent you from chasing the hated Saxons from your coasts now. At one of his huge rallies on Tara Hill, he reminded the crowd that their forefathers had beaten the Danes on that very ground in 978 AD.
But the most powerful symbol he used was the Battle of Clontarf.
The most potent, yes, fought in 1014 near Dublin. A truly sanguinary conflict. The Irish, led by King Brian Boru, achieved a decisive victory. But Brian tragically fell just as the battle concluded.
And this victory became a cornerstone of Irish historical consciousness. But O'Connell's movement needed more than just the historical truth.
They adhered strictly to later chroniclers who had painted the victory at Clontarf in colors that were, well, far too brilliant. They enhanced the scale of the victory well beyond what contemporary accounts suggest.
And the political narrative they built was that Clontarf utterly annihilated Danish power.
Completely. That it saved the island's independence and freedom. The story was that not a single Dane or Norwegian remained in Ireland after the battle.
Which we know is demonstrably inaccurate.
Of course. The Norse settlements in towns like Dublin recovered their strength quite quickly. But the myth was more powerful than the fact.
And Brian Boru became the ultimate martyr for national deliverance.
He was extolled as such. His portrait, pictures of the battle, all highly exaggerated, were distributed among the populace in immense quantities. It was a very effective propaganda campaign.
The symbolism was paramount. Clontarf was featured on the tickets for members of his repeal association.
And then he announced that the next major repeal meeting would be held on the plain of Clontarf itself.
The message couldn't have been clearer. It was impossible to miss. The parallel was explicit. Just as the Irish, under Brian Boru, defeated the Danes here, you should now follow O'Connell, who, by the way, strategically claimed descent from Brian Boru and expel the English. And although the government banned that meeting, the ideological connection was already firmly set in the public mind.
It was. And these extravagant ideas about Clontarf continued to be generally accepted, not just by O'Connell's old Irelanders, but also by the more militant young Irelanders who came after.
And in their rhetoric, the Danes and the English were always linked.
Consistently. The war cry, the Saxon and the Dane, became a recurring refrain, conceptually equating the two foreign invaders as a single, continuous line of historical oppression.
And almost no one challenged this narrative.
It's very rare to find a dissenting voice. A repealer named Mr. Holmes was one of the few who suggested that maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if the Danes had remained. His reasoning was strategic.
That a combined Irish-Danish force could have resisted the English.
That was his implication. That a combined fleet, a unified force, might have been capable of resisting their more powerful English neighbors. But that alternative view was largely suppressed by the political utility of the annihilation myth.
So when we try to move past the myth and evaluate the actual historical events, we have to look at the sources themselves.
And one of the most frequent complaints you hear, especially in modern histories, is that the Northmen destroyed Irish civilization. That they choked this national literature that was just starting to take root.
And those remaining relics of that literature, the annals, the old songs, they become incredibly important.
They're of peculiar importance, yes.
Right.
They provide the primary narrative from the perspective of the conquered. And the Irish records on this subject are significantly more copious than the Scandinavian Sagas.
They paid a lot of attention to the Northmen.
The oldest chronicles devote almost as much attention to the battles with the Norwegians and Danes as they do to the internal state of the island. There's a singular chronicle from the late 11th century, The Wars of the Irish and the Northmen.
And that's a comprehensive account.
It is. It details every major battle right down to Clontarf. It's a treasure trove of information about Norwegian settlements, their warfare, their weapons. And it was written so close to the events it's describing.
But we have to be cautious with these Irish accounts.
Absolutely. They inherently reflect the hatred and prejudice of a Christian population against heathen invaders. They often have the feel of early poetical legends, not dry historical reporting. They blend divine prophecy with military details.
Legends about saints predicting the invasion.
Yes. Saints like Columkill and Bersin foretelling the coming of the heathens and the devastation that would follow. The accounts detail how churches and convents were repeatedly plundered, burned, desecrated.
And they focus on these highly symbolic acts of desecration.
They do, to shock the reader. There's a famous account of the wife of the heathen chief Turges, a woman named Odo, who supposedly sat on the high altar of the church in Clonmacnoise,
Using it as a throne.
using the most sacred Christian space as a throne to receive homage. It's a powerful piece of propaganda detailing the profanity of the invaders.
And later, Irish scholars compiled these horrors.
Dúald MacFirbis, writing around 1650, detailed the scale of the invasion. He said all the evils that had befallen Ireland before were negligible compared to this. The Gauls, the foreigners, spread everywhere, built their own fortifications, cahirs, and castles, and showed respect to no one.
And he describes a very systemic oppression.
Comprehensive and systemic. The Gauls would kill the Irish kings and carry their queens and noble ladies into bondage, systematically dismantling the native social hierarchy. A king over every territory, a chief on every chieftaincy, an abbot in every church, a bailiff in every town.
And a soldier in every Irish house.
A soldier in every house, so that no native man had power over anything of his own. The economic cruelty was just as systematic.
The tribute system.
A measure of weight of gold or silver annually from every person. And if you couldn't pay, you either faced bondage or, strikingly, you had your nose cut off. A gruesome physical mark of subjugation.
And just as they embellish the cruelty, they also exaggerate their own victories.
Frequently, yes. That same chronicle, The Wars of the Irish and the Northmen, claims that after Brian Boru's victory at Glenmama, the servitude was absolute. It claims there wasn't a threshing spot from Howth to Brandon and Kerry without an enslaved Dane threshing on it.
A powerful image, but likely an overstatement.
It almost certainly is. Now, the Scandinavian Sagas, in contrast, they offer a very different tone and scope.
They're much shorter.
Much shorter, and they usually just focus on single events. They often treat Ireland, incidentally, as part of the broader movements of a specific jarl. If you only read the sagas, you'd think the Norwegian dominion was much smaller than the Irish records claim.
But what they do relate is highly trustworthy.
For the most part, yes. And it agrees surprisingly well with the contemporary Irish accounts. It suggests the writers either were there themselves or got their knowledge from men who knew the country well from raiding or trading.
The geographical accuracy is the most remarkable proof of that.
It really is. For instance, the ancient seat of royalty, Cara, is mentioned in the Congaspile as the Mar. And the text includes the detail that the town sank into the earth because a king gave an unjust judgment, a tradition that is still common in Irish folklore today.
So they knew the local legends.
They did, and they mention specific places that we've only recently been able to confirm. The Congaspile talks about a church on an island called Mistradan in Lochern. We now know that's Innisdrecken in Lochern, where St. Jeremias did, in fact, have a church.
The names are just slight corruptions.
Exactly. You see the same with Brian Boru's castle. The sagas call it Kintaraborg. In Irish, it was Shankared, pronounced Kinkara. The Norwegians just added their ending, borg, for a town or fort.
And they even provide navigational details.
Detailed ones. They state you could sail from Iceland to a place in Ireland called Joldalop in about 8 days. Joldalop just means the course or breaking of the waves. It's a direct translation of the Gaelic name Corrybrookan.
The famous whirlpool near Rathlin Island.
The very one. And Rathlin was the chief station in the passage from Ireland to Scotland. So naming that spot shows a very sophisticated level of navigational intelligence.
Then there's the corroboration from Snorri Sturluson.
A remarkable case. He relates a naval battle in the early 11th century between an Orkney Jarl and an Irish king in a place called Ulfric's Fjord. For centuries, no one knew where that was.
Until an Old English document provided the clue.
A document from King John in 1210 refers to Lough Larne on the east coast as Wulfrichford, which is an almost perfect match for the Icelandic Ulfric's Fjord.
And then physical evidence was found there.
In a fascinating coincidence, shortly before that name was identified, a purely Scandinavian iron sword and a human skeleton were dug up right on the shores of Lough Larne. The style of the sword is characteristic of that specific period.
So it's very likely that the remains of a warrior from that exact battle.
It strongly suggests it. This combination of physical evidence and a rediscovered place name really bolsters the credibility of the Scandinavian accounts.
Which brings us to the identity of these invaders, which is more complex than just Danes.
Much more. Both sets of records confirm settlement began early, first raids in 795 AD, and by the 9th century, many were firmly entrenched. And this led to intermarriage very quickly.
We see evidence of that in the settlement of Iceland?
We do. Descendants of Norwegians settled in Ireland are among Iceland's founders. And you see Irish names like Jaran and Angel among early Icelanders. It shows Ireland wasn't just a raiding ground, but a major nexus for culture across the North Atlantic.
But the Irish chroniclers themselves made a crucial distinction.
The most insightful detail, really. They differentiated between two groups based on appearance. The light-haired Finnloch Lanach, the Norwegians, and the dark-haired Dubloch Lanach, the Danes.
Fingal and Dubgal. Light foreigners and dark foreigners.
This color coding shows a highly nuanced understanding of who was invading them. And the Wars of the Irish and the Northmen explicitly states that the Danes were only one of the tribes involved.
And these two groups often fought each other.
Intensely. For dominion in Ireland. The annals record in 845 AD that the Dubgauls, the Danes, arrived in Dublin, massacred the Fingalls, the Norwegians, and destroyed their fortresses.
Though they would also ally against the Irish.
Of course, especially when a unified front was needed. And we find physical proof of Danish settlement. There's a small town called Baldoyle, in an area originally called Fingal, or the Stranger's Land.
Which was mainly Norwegian.
Right. But in old documents, Baldoyle is named Balu Dubgale, which means the Dubgauls or Danes town. It confirms the Danes were intermixed with the Norwegians.
And the nature of the Scandinavian dominion, it was very characteristic.
Yeah, very. It was divided into several small, scattered kingdoms, usually confined to a town and a small adjacent tract of land. That these urban kingdoms persisted for centuries is one of the most remarkable facts of the period.
So they concentrated their power, fundamentally strategic. The native population was just too large, the island too remote. It was dangerous to be isolated in rural districts. So they concentrated their strength behind ramparts in the towns that are still Ireland's most important cities: Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, Limerick. And their lasting influence is right there in the language, in the place names, profoundly, in the names of 3 of Ireland's 4 provinces: Ulster, Leinster, and Munster. The original Irish forms, Ulad, Lehin, Mumha, were all given the Scandinavian ending stard, which means place. In English, that becomes the suffix "suster." And it's even suggested that the name Ireland itself has that influence.
It is. The Irish still call the country Ireland or Erie. The termination land is unknown in their language. The fact that the Northmen could impose names on the 3 most important provinces shows they must have been settled in considerable numbers, or at least ruled for a very long time.
But if you look at the rural place names, you don't see that same level of influence.
You search in vain for the kind of extensive Scandinavian colonization you see in northern England. All the circumstances point to the Northmen being proportionately much less settled in the rural districts and much more concentrated in those strategic, defensible coastal towns. A dominion that was deep, but geographically very narrow.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought. Considering that these Norwegian settlements recovered so quickly after the setback at Clontarf, and they maintained strategic control over coastal trade for centuries, was the Battle of Clontarf really the definitive annihilation of Scandinavian power that later political movements claimed it was?
Or was it perhaps just the most successful expression of Irish resistance that ultimately failed to translate into true, lasting independence, and doing so simply set the stage for the next and even more potent wave of foreign conquest?
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.